Prince Edward Island is a small Canadian province off the east coast of the country. 200 kilometers from end to end, the island is home to about 140,000 people, and although it's changed a lot in recent years, it's still largely a rural province with an economy anchored to agriculture and the fishery. The island has always been particularly vulnerable to fluctuations in fossil fuel prices, no more so than in 1973, when the energy crisis that saw the price of oil quadruple in a single season threatened to cripple the island economy. The governments of the day reacted by pouring money into renewable energy and sustainable design projects. Perhaps the most prominent of these was the ARC, built as a laboratory for experimenting with alternative approaches to design, energy, and food production. While the spark that gave rise to projects like the ARC wasn't climate change, surely there are lessons to be learned about energy and about design that are even more relevant today. To find out, I went to see David Bergmark, one of the project's architects and builders. I asked David to start at the beginning and to tell me about the New Alchemists.
From the New Alchemy Institute, and had occasion to go down and visit the site. This was right after I graduated from Yale School of Architecture, and I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to start my career in architecture. And there had been a few courses in sustainable design, but really they focused around the development of solar collectors on roofs, that kind of thing. They weren't quite the holistic approach. So when on my first visit to the New Alchemy Institute, which happened to be on a full night of the full moon, and the windmills are cranking the water, pumping water, and the water's trickling from pond to pond, and there's solar collectors just glinting in the moonlight. I was just totally enthralled with the fact that this was looking at the system from a much more holistic approach than just how do you make heat, how do you produce heat to heat your house. But this was looking at it from the point of view of how do you sustain yourself in the house from the point of view of food and warmth and the whole picture. I was visioning myself as being a professional architect. That was my career. Okay. And along with that, there are certain trappings that come with that. The New Alchemy Institute was based on a much more communal approach, in that they had individuals working there with completely diverse backgrounds, everything from PhDs in microbiology to whatever, and to those just interested in working with the earth and growing crops and that kind of thing. So they had established issues like equal salaries for everybody. There was a total equality at the farm, and so it was interesting for me to step in here because I saw myself as being a professional architect. And I guess the way in which I first became involved with them is they were developing this concept for Canada, for this Canadian ARC. They had met with Andy Wells, and they had met with, I believe they had met with some government officials about the possibility of putting in a proposal to represent Canada at the United Nations Habitat Exposition in 1976. So they were working together. They were working on this proposal, and when I suggested that I was an architect and I'd be interested in looking at what they were doing, they brought out their plans, and they were really quite amazing. They were really quite good, but they were very organic. They were not the sort of the type of plans that we had been taught in an academic world to produce, and to have that kind of professionalism. And I thought at the time that maybe they could benefit from that, because essentially they were presenting to individuals in the Canadian government who were going to be looking at this from a professional point of view. Let's face it, they didn't want to be giving money to a bunch of hippies who were developing a facility where they could go and live, in eastern Canada. They wanted something that was something more understandable for themselves. So I volunteered my time to work on this proposal. I think there was 2 or 3 days to work on it, and I kind of worked days to put something together. My my return for doing that work was to say to them, in the event that this is successful, I would like to be your architect on the project. And it was interesting because I think they actually went through, when they received the funding for it, I think the funders wanted to be sure that they were putting something together that was reputable, and I think that they, at that time, I think they actually went out and interviewed architects to do the job, and then discovered that they cost far more than they expected them to cost. So they came back to me and said, "What can you do for us?" So I got together with an old friend, or an individual who I'd worked for before, building houses, and who was an architect, Ola Hammerland, and the two of us went down to Cape Cod and spent a weekend there and came up with a name for the company and started our career. It was absolutely fantastic because we were, and I definitely owe it to everybody at the New Alchemy Institute who brought together concepts that had heretofore not been thought about. We had the opportunity to actually work with people who in those days were like studying different kinds of things. For example, we worked with a couple of guys, Sean Wellesley Miller and Dave Cerruti, who were studying at MIT at the time, and they were developing plastic films, which now is on the market as heat mirror glazing. We were just fooling around with these kind of things. We were putting layers of glazing material and testing how they reacted under sunlight and how they absorbed the heat and retained it within structures. And we built all kinds of experimental structures to make sure that this thing was going to work on a large scale. It was quite interesting. At the same time, the New Alchemy Institute was developing a facility on Cape Cod as well. So they were building the Cape Cod Arc.
Right.
The Cape Cod Arc was a low-tech version of the PEI arc, which was being basically done on no money, yeah. And the PEI arc was funded to some degree with what now sounds like very little money to do this rather large 7,000 or 8,000 square foot building. So to get this, we did the plan, and then came to PEI again, open, naive, open eyes, thinking that, that we were going to just give this to a PEI contractor and it would be built, and yes, we would go ahead and, with our career, so to speak, work on other things. And of course, when we came here, we were introduced to the biggest construction company on the island, who kind of just looked at it and kind of rolled their eyes a little bit. And we realized that it wasn't going to get built unless somebody stayed here and built it. So I kind of came for the weekend and ended up staying here for 35 years.
Yes.
Well, it was quite interesting because not only were we plopping down this building, but you also plopped me and several other individuals down into the middle of this thing too, and we became completely immersed in the culture of what was going on in that particular area. It was in Little Pond, PEI, and we always laughed, like about being big fish in a little pond sort of thing. But in fact, we were definitely the focus of people knew we were there. They knew we were from away. They knew we were building this project, which they looked at rather skeptically, and for the reason that it was difficult. They were still aspiring to having it wasn't more than 10 years earlier that most of the houses had outhouses, right, and didn't have plumbing inside the house. And we had a Clevis Maltrum toilet, which was a composting toilet, which is an outhouse within the house, so to speak. So they looked at a lot of these technologies extremely skeptically, and second of all, they looked at them as if they knew these technologies. They knew all of them. I mean, they knew the fact that the south side of your house, got solar insulation and was the warm side of the house. I mean, they knew all of these things, and I felt kind of in a way kind of funny doing them, in other areas, like in Boston, they didn't really know these things.
Right.
You know, but everybody here on PEI was very close to this activity. So there was a lot of skepticism about it. The other thing is that there's a whole money issue that happens here in PEI. You know, at the time there was government money being funded in this, so there were two attitudes. One is, well, it's government money, so it's my money, so I can come here and look at this place anytime I want, and that was fine. And we tried, you know, I tried to always accommodate when people came all times, day and night, to see this place, and that was great, you know. The other thing about it was that we were repeating technologies that, in some sense, they were trying to overcome. And it wasn't long before, you know, before we discovered that the best thing about this building was the passive solar elements of it. That the simplicity of the concept of like translating concepts into a very simple solution. Those concepts worked. The ones that didn't, the ones that were difficult is that the ones that cost a lot of money and involved a tremendous amount of ingenuity to try to make them work, those were the ones that had huge amounts of embodied energy in them and therefore basically weren't sustainable. The things that got retained from the ARC concept were, you turn on the television, you'd see, you know, the housewife standing in her kitchen with underneath the greenhouse windows with the sun coming in. Those sort of things caught on very quickly. So those were the only things that were retained from that. The issues of conservation really went by the wayside, and you know, I was thinking about that this morning. We became more and more marginalized after we designed and built the ARC. We became the ARC was kind of an albatross around my neck for about 20 years during that whole boom of energy and Wall Street.
Right.
I actually couldn't admit to it that I had done the ARC because it was considered to be somehow a reflection of the fact that I had a hippie background, that we were really tree huggers and environmentalists in the worst sense of the word, if there is a bad sense to that word. So that, you know, connotations of who we were, that companies and industry and the powers that be seem to try to marginalize those groups who are trying to do things. And that's why it's very difficult today, nowadays. And if you look at right up to today, where you know, the U.S. is trying to develop some sort of policy in terms of sustainable design, and that they are basically unable to do it because the belief is that it will affect the economy of the country, and that they can't understand that relationship between economies of, you know, sustainable economies and quote Wall Street economies can ever come together, which I believe very strongly that they can, and that you can have a tremendous impact on the world in terms of environmentally, and at the same time, you know, have an economy that is flourishing. It's interesting because that essentially in the United States, that's what Obama is saying, is the first country to the finish line, or to the winning line. We better not say the finish line, but the first person who wins that race will be the successful country from an economic point. Systemic changes in urban planning would have just huge impact on how we use how much energy we use. That in comparison to the energy that you use in your home, these kind of changes would impact tremendously. It's the same thing. It's like, you know, in our when we first got a computer, we had this little memory, right? Because all we were doing was typing letters. Now we're like saving photographs and doing 3D, 3D renderings and doing animations through buildings, and so the memory is that much larger. And that the relationship of what you can do in communities compared to what you can do as an individual is that kind of quantum leap.
Right.
And so I'm not sure whether it's possible that by keeping that focus on individuals, we definitely don't look at the larger picture. And that's the same thing I worry about the whole global warming issue, is that people are looking at it as a linear change. These things don't happen so it's a negative for global warming. It's a positive for people involved with sustainable development. The negative in global warming is it doesn't happen in a linear way. It happens in a very fast curve. Like as things start happening, as global warming starts taking place, things will start developing very, very quickly, and climate change will happen very, very quickly. And we've seen that. It's happening much, much quicker than anticipated. But in the same way that if we could only get some critical mass started amongst ourselves, say here in Charlottetown, then we would affect those systemic changes that actually had the huge impact. It's one thing for us all to save a bit of energy, but if we all had that like understanding about sustainable design, then probably we're going to turn around and change how our communities work. There's a huge opportunity because generally we can all understand what are the things that we could do to kind of make these changes. The question is whether we have the will to do that. You know, I've been extremely disappointed that from a political point of view, that we haven't had that kind of leadership to do something there. And I think that was the thing that was so exciting at that time, was there was that spark.
The Ark opened in September of 1976 with much ceremony. Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau flew in by helicopter, and people like Stuart Brand and Jay Baldwin from the Whole Earth movement were there. Reading descriptions of the time, you can sense that spark was very much in the air, and our tiny island was, for the moment, a center of a new movement. By the 1980s, however, oil prices had begun to fall, and government support for projects like the Ark was on the wane. Struggles for funding and debates over ownership and agenda meant that by 1981, the once promising Ark project was over. And then, for 20 years, the issues that the Ark brought to the fore, renewable energy, sustainable design, self-sufficiency, and as Pierre Trudeau said at the Ark's opening, a need to live lightly on the land, had faded out of the public consciousness. Today, though, the Ark's ethos seems more timely than ever, and there's a lot to be learned both from the Ark's successes and the Ark's failures. Fortunately, we still have people like David Bergmark around to point the way.